It's day 11 of our Who Was Martin Luther King reading. Today we are reading chapter 9. Chapter 9 is called The Peace Prize. Martin showed people all over the world the power of words, not fists. In 1964, Martin was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. This award is given almost every year to the person or group who has done something important in the cause of world peace. Martin was very grateful for this award, but he knew it wasn't his alone. It belonged to the thousands of brave people who had taken part in the nonviolent fight for equal rights. Martin gave away all the prize money, $54,000, to civil rights groups. Martin Luther King Jr. had won the Nobel Peace Prize, but he knew he had not reached his goal, equality for all people. He thought about the defeat in Albany and the success in Birmingham. Surely there were other cities where Martin could help end segregation. Martin's eyes turned toward Selma, Alabama. Although half of Selma's residents were black, only 1% was registered to vote. The voting office was only open a few days a month, which made it difficult for people to register. In addition, the literacy test was so hard, Martin said that even the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court might not know some of the answers. Oh, sorry. My neighbor's dog just barked. It scared me. Okay, back on track. For weeks, Martin led groups to the courthouse to register to vote. But it was not legal to hold marches in Selma. So the groups were arrested. Thousands of black people were sent to jail just because they wanted the right to vote. On February 1st, 1965, Martin Luther King was arrested during one of the marches. While Martin was in jail, a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee invited a man named Malcolm X to Selma to speak. Malcolm X was a young black leader who disagreed with Martin's peaceful protests. Malcolm X did not believe in fighting with words alone. He thought it was okay to use your fists and more. Malcolm X also spoke about black pride, how blacks should respect themselves and be proud of their race. While Martin Luther King Jr. was in jail, he wrote a letter that was published in the New York Times. In the letter, Martin said, "There are more Negroes in jail with me than there are on the voting rolls." Marches spread to many counties in Alabama. One night, a black marcher, Jimmy Lee Jackson, was shot during the voter registration drive. He was 26 years old. Before he died, Jimmy Lee said that there was a state trooper had gunned him down. The black community in Selma was outraged, but Martin did not want people to fight back with more violence. He thought Malcolm X was wrong. So Martin organized a march from Selma to Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, to demand voting rights for black people. At the time, the governor of Alabama was George Wallace. He did not want the march to take place. He put a ban on it. Did this stop Martin? No. On March 7th, 650 marchers set out to Montgomery. Since this was a Sunday, Martin stayed back at his church to Atlanta to preach. He planned to take a plane to Montgomery later that day to meet up with the marchers. As usual, the protesters were marching in peace, but soon, state troopers armed with nightsticks and tear gas appeared. They attacked the group. Some state troopers on horseback trampled the marchers. About 70 people were injured. The violence was captured by television cameras. People all over the country were so angry about what had happened that they protested in their own cities. Martin, too, was horrified at the news. He also felt guilty about not being with the marchers, so he planned another march 2 days later. On March 9th, Martin led a group of 1,500 from Selma towards Montgomery. Beforehand, Martin told people to leave the line if they had any doubts about remaining. He had to be sure that they wouldn't fight back even if they were beaten up. As they crossed the bridge, the marchers faced a wall of state troopers. Martin saw that many would be hurt, even killed. Marching was one thing, getting murdered was another, so he had the group turn back around. Then good news arrived, very good news. President Johnson said the protesters had the right to march. He promised to send in troops to protect the marchers. Suddenly, people from all over the country wanted to join in. On March 21st, the group set out, protesters, Catholics, Jews, blacks, and whites all marching together. To Martin, it was a beautiful sight. People walked through the quiet valleys and over steep hills. They walked along highways, stopping only to rest for a minute or two. Their bodies ached. Their feet were sore, but their hearts were light. By the time they reached Montgomery, they were 25,000 strong. At the state capitol building, they handed a petition to Governor George Wallace demanding voting rights for black Americans. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. President Johnson said, "Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. Yet the harsh fact is that in many places in this country, men and women are kept from voting simply because they are black." Now, there would be no more literacy tests, and United States government workers would be in charge of registering voters. The Selma Freedom Marchers had won. 25,000 people. All right, and then I'm going to read this little part right here. Civil rights leaders who gave their lives for the cause. Medgar Evers was from Mississippi. Growing up, he always questioned the Jim Crow laws. By the time he was in college, he started local chapters of the NAACP, and after being turned down by the University of Mississippi Law School, he fought for the desegregation of the school. On March 12, 1963, Evers was killed. He was 37 years old. A white man named Brian D. Beckwith was accused of the murder. He stood trial twice in the 1960s, but the all-white juries in both cases could not decide if he was guilty or innocent. Finally, in a third trial in 1995, 31 years after Evers died, Beckwith was found guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. So, 31 years after he was killed, finally his murderer was put in jail. That's pretty crazy. Andrew Goodman was from New York City. In 1964, Goodman and Mickey Schreiner, who was from Philadelphia, went to Mississippi to register blacks to vote. Both Andrew and Mickey were white. On the night of June 20th, 1964, the two reached Meridian, Mississippi. There, a black man named James Chaney joined the group. The 3 civil rights workers were arrested for speeding and told to leave town, but members of nonviolent racist groups called the KKK tracked them down and killed them. They were all young men, and when they died, Goodman was 21, Shermer was 25, and Shawnee was 21. In 1967, 19 white men were arrested for the deaths of the 3 civil rights workers. 7 of the men were found guilty. 2, E.J. Barrett, who was running for sheriff of Meridian, and Edgar Ray Killen, a local minister, were set free because the jury could not reach a decision. It wasn't until almost 40 years later, in 2005, that Killen was also found guilty of the murders. So again, they had to wait, what was that one? 40 years for their people that killed them. And they know who did it. They just didn't arrest them. Okay, that is the end of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 is called Fighting Poverty, and we will read that tomorrow.